Good morning, everyone. We have got a full day ahead of us, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited you've joined us. My name is Arlen Burgess. I'm the Associate Director for Operations and Strategic Initiatives in the School of Data Science here at UVA. Again, we are so excited for you guys to join us here at the 5th annual Datapalooza, very exciting for us, and our first Datapalooza as a school of data science. So really exciting, big steps for us, and we're glad that you guys have joined us here today. I'm just going to go through a couple of logistical things, let you know how the day is going to go. Fear not if you forget what I tell you now. There are going to be lots of people to help you along the way. But the setup here is such that we're operating out of a couple of different spaces in a couple of different rooms, and we hope to make things run as smoothly as possible. So the room that those of you that are here with us right now and not viewing on live stream that are here, this is the ballroom on the 9th floor here at the Graduate. We will be having panels in 3 rooms here in the Graduate, so this is the ballroom on the 9th floor. There is the game room on the 2nd floor and the Sheepdog Cafe on the 1st floor. If you're willing to go downstairs, we recognize the elevators coming up to the 9th floor is quite better than stairs, but if you're wanting to go downstairs to get to panels, we will have the stairs open if you want to take the stairs down in between. We are going to have quick transitions, and we are also going to have a full day of programming that's going to be taking place at the corner building, which is once you go outside, right down to the corner and across the street. We will, again, have people that will be helping to lead you there. It's a very quick walk, so please don't let the distance between here and there keep you from that outstanding programming that'll be going on all day as well. There is a very short period of time. We did leave breaks of about 10 to 15 minutes, but we also know that speakers sometimes tend to go over, which is great because there's so much exciting stuff going on. So please try and move quickly in between sessions. Again, if you have any questions throughout the day, please do let us know. And we will have a fantastic panel of industry folks here at lunch, and we'll be back in this room, but we will be live streaming that over at the corner building where we'll also be providing lunch, so if we need some overflow there as well. If there is overflow during these keynote sessions, they'll be live streamed down in the other rooms here as well. So again, lots of information, but please do ask. People at the registration tables, I was going to say anybody with a pin, but hopefully all of you grabbed your lapel pin, so not everybody with a lapel pin may know the answer to all the questions. So again, I'm Arlen. Feel free to find me. Definitely folks in data science t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all of that kind of stuff as well. So again, we recognize it's a little warm in here, so we're going to do our best to try and bring the temperature down a little bit. It's just going to get hotter with all of the exciting stuff that's going on in data science, right? Hottest field of the 21st century, so we're ready to go. All the panels are first come, first serve. So if there's no room in the panel that you go to, please find another session. We are using this as a really exciting way to think about what the research agenda for the new School of Data Science is going to look like and how all of you are going to be such an exciting part of helping to shape that. So you don't need to hear any more from me. A little bit more about that to get us introduced to the day. I want to introduce the Dean of the School of Data Science, Phil Bourne.
Thanks, Arlen. I noticed there's a sort of echo with this system. It makes you sound like you know what you're talking about, which you'll soon realize is not the truth. But anyway, pressing on. Thank you for being here. It's really wonderful to see so many people here. We're doing something a little different this year, but before I say anything about that, let me say that it has been a monumental time since we met for Datapalooza last year. The formation of the school, which you know about, is now underway, and we're all really in the process of building that out. As you know, it was in part a result of the largest gift in the university's history, thanks to the Quantitative Foundation. We're very grateful for that. That's allowing us just a bit of very recent updated news. Part of that is to build a building for the school, which is going to be on the Emmett Ivy corridor. It's actually along with a residential hotel. We shouldn't be saying that when we're in someone else's hotel. But the residential hotel and conference centre and our building will go up at the same time to open that 14-acre site that's going to connect North Grounds to Central Grounds. We selected an architectural firm this week, and we are now beginning the process of designing a very exciting building, which will open early in, we hope, in 2023. So I think there's talk about all sorts of other activities going on that site, including a performing arts centre. So it's a very exciting time. It's time for us now to focus on research, and so that's what this is about today. It's not so much about a more general introduction to data science, which we've done in Datapalooza in previous years. It's more with a focus group to get at some key questions. And so with the 2 keynotes and the 17 panels we have, we're really trying to dig in to the kinds of questions that we need to address. So in general terms, it's really the question is how are we uniquely positioned to make significant impact in research at the intersection of data science and each domain area. And so you're going to hear from a lot of different domain areas today. And so from those discussions, we want to take away, we'll have note takers there, and it's going to drive to a significant degree what we decide to do going forward. So what specific topic areas in the broad sense should we be focusing our research on? What questions can we hope to address within those areas? These are the key things we want to take away from this. And then how do those specific areas and questions align with the UVA strategic plan and the needs of the Commonwealth, the nation, and the world? So that's really what we want to get out of today. And we're using you to get there, so thank you for being here and doing it. And I hope you have a very enjoyable day. So it's now my honour to introduce our first keynote of the day, Victoria Stodden. Victoria is an associate professor at the University of Illinois School of Information Sciences. She has an unusual and, in my view, much welcome background with a PhD in statistics from Stanford, a master's in legal studies from Stanford Law School, a master's in economics from the University of British Columbia, and a bachelor's in economics from the University of Ottawa. Prior to joining the iSchool, she was an assistant professor of statistics at Columbia. Her focus areas of research are a number, but she is really dedicated to enabling reproducibility in computational science, including the study of adequacy and robustness in replicated results, designing and implementing validation systems, developing standards of openness, and so forth. She co-chairs the NSF Advisory Committee for Cyber Infrastructure, as a member of the NSF Directorate of SCIENCE, Computer and Information Science and Engineering. She also serves on the National Academies Committee on Responsible Science, ensuring the integrity of the research process, for which they've produced a report which is really driving a lot of the developments. I came to know Victoria through her work in reproducibility. She is a leader in this field, and we're very fortunate to have her here today, and I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. Come.
Okay, I'll just wait a couple of minutes till there we go. So it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the generous introduction, Phil. I think I echo all of Phil's enthusiasm around data science and the opportunities it's presenting to us as the research community to take on challenges that maybe have been inaccessible to us before. So in my few minutes this morning, I wanted to think about how we conceptualize data science as a research entity, and discuss a little bit, actually Phil touched on this in the introduction, discuss a little bit about steps that the community has been taking in thinking about aspects around data science, reproducibility, and sort of different steps that we've been taking, both policy-wise and in terms of practices. So the first thing I think I need to start with is research is no different than other aspects in society and in the economy in the sense that we're being disrupted by technology, particularly digital technology. So we have, I think some of this gathering today is really a reflection of the enormous amounts of data that are creating opportunities for research, different types of infrastructure and technologies that are allowing us to leverage the data, for example. So one of the core aspects of my own research has been, how do we really embrace these new modalities, in a sense, for which we're doing research, and make sure that this is something that really conforms with our scientific norms and produces the high-quality research that the scientific community has been producing for decades. So we have disruption I want to touch on, and then, as Phil mentioned, the core of my research has been thinking through issues to do with reproducibility and replication in research, particularly with a focus on that technological disruption that we're undergoing as a community. Then I want to touch on, as I mentioned, some of the steps that the community has been taking. For example, recommendations coming from AAAS workshop that I was involved with, and also National Academy's reports that I was involved in. The reason I mention those is I think they sort of point the way in some sense as to where the community is in terms of thinking about these issues and how we could actually start to really leverage some of that to really make sure that our research is as useful and accessible as it really could be. Okay, and then I finish with a few thoughts on data science itself. Okay, so the disruption, the technological impact on research and on scientific investigation, I think we're sitting here because we all recognize that data is available and more available than ever in more fields and more disciplines than ever. This is something that's not impacting just sort of traditionally research and data intensive areas, but it's impacting fields that traditionally would not have thought of themselves as necessarily data oriented. So we're seeing this kind of real change right across the research landscape in how these communities start embracing data and using it for their own research ends. And we see this not just in scale, right, or pervasiveness. We also see different types of data that are landing on the scene, making for even more interesting opportunities for research. So, for example, extremely high dimensional data, upending the types of statistical analysis that we've traditionally done on data, so we need a whole new sort of arsenal of methodological developments to handle these new types of data, which is extremely exciting. At the same time as we've seen these sort of massive increases in data, we've also seen massive increases in computational power. And so not only has that enabled the analysis of big data, but also smaller scale data, and it's enabled us to ask new questions of the data. So we can do things because of the computational power, like simulate a physical system at some resolution or scale that we think is useful, ask what happens when we actually do that simulation, change parameters in that system, rerun the simulation, and start to understand and ask scientific and research questions that way. This is entirely coming from our increased computational power, but it engages our data as well. So we're seeing these two types of disruption happening. I think there's a third type of disruption that's happening as well, that's almost never talked about, and that is through the use and the leveraging of software as a tool of investigation. So we have situations now where there are deep intellectual, real scientific contributions that are happening in the software. These could be the development of analysis methods, the implementation of the methods and the algorithms in the software itself. And rarely, as I'll get to in the rest of my talk, rarely do those contributions actually come out in the scholarly record and are made available to the community. So now we're in this situation where we have these deep intellectual contributions that are encoded only in software. So what are we doing about access, transparency, reuse of methodology in that situation? So those are the questions that I'll start to answer in the rest of the talk. I can't promise you I'll answer all the questions, but we can raise them, and like I said, I'll get some hopefully discussions going about where the community is on these questions. So that leads me to a claim that just about all our discoveries today in the research community have some computational component somewhere. They either have leveraged data in some way, done some type of analysis in the software. There's some computational component that underlies that inference or that discovery. The corollary is that I perceive a mismatch between the process of scientific and research discovery today and how we actually disseminate those results to the community. It's very typical to do the dissemination in a way that hasn't changed in hundreds of years, where of course it's written up in a PDF. Now just think for a moment about sort of the English language description of some of those reasonably complex computational pipelines that have led to the findings, and you can start to see the gaps in dissemination, I think. Okay, so that's the main theme of my discussion today. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the concept of reproducibility. No doubt you've heard of it, and there's been a lot of discussions over the last few years, including front page of the New York Times. And so this has become an issue, I think, that is important to grapple, no matter where you are in terms of the research that you're actually carrying out or the types of questions the community is asking. I have found it useful to think about reproducibility in sort of three separate ways. They are overlapping, but I think this is a sort of useful framework to be able to understand what's meant by reproducibility, what the issues might be associated with reproducibility, and if there are issues that people think need attention, what steps and remedies might be taken. So I've pulled it out into notions of empirical reproducibility, statistical reproducibility, and computational reproducibility, and I'll just take a few minutes to explain what I mean by each of those. So unfortunately, this slide did not reproduce, so I'm missing an image here which I think was too high resolution, but I'll just explain it when I get there. So for empirical reproducibility, what I mean by that is our traditional notions of reproducibility. So if you sort of look back in scientific history, the notions of reproducibility as part of scientific discovery and dissemination was actually instantiated by Robert Boyle at the very early days of the creation of the first journal in the 1660s. So this is a very, very old concept in research. So the first example that I put here of what I consider empirical reproducibility, or sort of Boyle's version of reproducibility, this is a 2-page publication that appeared in Cell Reports in 2014. The reason I flag it is this is a discussion that came from a project that was a joint proposal between a lab at Berkeley and a lab at Harvard. In their proposal, they said, if we're funded, what we will do is spend 2 months at the outset of our project, and we will ensure that the lab processes at each of the 2 locations are producing, in a sense, identical output, so the cell output. And what that meant was you wouldn't be able to look at any of the output and determine, there's no signature that determines what lab it actually came from. So this seems sort of like a pretty obvious baseline you would want to do in your research, that any conclusions are actually coming from the process and the discovery itself, not from some artifact or some lab, right? So this became a publication because it actually took them 2 years to reconcile the different processes that were going on between the 2 different labs and ensure that the results, the sort of physical results, were identical in the 2 processes. I'm not a biologist. My read of the article, it seemed like one lab at some stage was stirring a beaker. Right? Another lab at that same stage was putting the beaker in the centrifuge. And this created enough to make a different signature on the output. Both labs thought this was obviously the way you would do it. Why would you do it any other different way? And it took them 2 years to actually discover that difference. So that's the type of thing that I think of as empirical reproducibility. My blanked out area there, I was pointing to a National Academies workshop on reproducibility when you involve animal models, for example. And the reason I put that picture there is because different ways of thinking about reproducibility means you might take different steps around reproducibility. We always kind of think of reproducibility as a great thing. Reproducible results, sounds awesome. If you are reproducing work and you're killing animals in the course of actually reproducing work, it brings a different set of ethical concerns to that question of reproducibility. Maybe it's not good to just continue to reproduce results, for example. Maybe there are sort of different factors that would weigh in. So that's what should have been there on the right-hand side. Okay, so contrast this with statistical reproducibility. So roughly what I'm thinking about on statistical reproducibility is, do those analysis methods justify the statistical conclusions that you are drawing from the data? Would you expect to see those conclusions generalized to new samples, for example, based on the statistical work that's been done? So in other words, have you done the stats right? There's lots of discussion around this over the last few years. For example, the use of p-values in statistical inference, for example, how they may be misused. For example, the file drawer problem. These sort of multiple testing environments that have happened and maybe allowing us to draw conclusions that may not be justified or may not be generalizable to new samples. And even beyond just the p-value question, all these questions about experimental design. Do you have sufficient power to draw the conclusions that you're actually drawing from the results, from the data? What's your experimental design? How have you actually sampled your data? Do you have the sample size to even support your conclusions? Big questions about data preparation. How have you done your identification of outliers, renormalization of your variables, for example. All of these steps that kind of prepare the data for analysis often don't even make it into the publication. Yet anyone who's done this type of work, you know that how you treat the outliers can actually be quite impactful on the results you draw from the data. So somehow this information seems very important and underrepresented or underreported in the output, the communication of the results. So have you done your choice of models correctly? How robust are your models? All these kind of statistical questions. So I wanted to give just one very quick example about how your framing of reproducibility can lead to your implementation of results or remedies. So in 2014, the journal Science made a set of changes to its submissions and author requirements. And the set of changes went directly, at least in my opinion, to statistical reproducibility. So they require now, starting in 2014, authors to submit a data handling plan, and it goes right to that question about how have your data actually been prepared for the analysis? How have you dealt with outliers, for example? An estimation of your sample size for effect size. So do you actually, how can you justify drawing the conclusions you're drawing from the data? Have you treated your samples randomly? How involved were people in the process? So do you have automated data collection, or do you have actual experimenters writing down observations, for example? So what level of engagement is there from the human side? And then they started doing statistical review for the articles as well. So to me, this reads very much like a response to statistical reproducibility concerns. They're not dealing with, for example, empirical reproducibility concerns here. Okay, so the final, I think, set of issues around reproducibility concern computational aspects. This is where recently I have focused much of my own work. And I'd like to just take one step back and give a little bit of framing for how we might think about the computational aspects. And of course, with computation, all data is embedded in some software system. So we have some computational aspects attending to our analysis of data, our collection, our warehousing of data, for example. So I wanted to just take a step back. Okay, so what do we mean by a scientific method as it implies to the generation of reliable conclusions from data? Well, let's think about what we actually mean. Typically, we've had two branches, right, developed hundreds of years ago. Our first branch, including mathematics, formal logic, for example, deductive reasoning. This, of course, falls short when you want to answer a question like, where on the floodplains of the Nile should I plant my crops for next year? Right? Deductive reasoning only brings you so far. So we developed the inductive branch of reasoning, so a statistical analysis of controlled experiments. This allows us to start to answer questions that are predictive in nature. So the fundamental question is, do we have any changes to these branches or the way we conceptualize and enact these branches of the scientific method due to all this technological disruption that I was describing? Lots of chatter about a third branch of the scientific method, fourth branch of the scientific method, arising from these large-scale simulations that we're carrying out, data-driven computational science, for example. I snuck in a little question mark there. So let's think about what it means to have a branch of the scientific method. So here's a couple of examples. I just sort of grabbed them. There's lots of examples out there, and I'm not trying to sort of highlight any one particular example. But the one on the left, This is a web page. As you can see, it's referring to a workshop from 1995. This is a NIST a workshop around modeling and simulation. And I pulled out some text. As I said, there's lots and lots of examples of this type of, this sort of framing paradigm. And the text that I pulled out, just describing this particular modeling and simulation workshop, it goes, it's common now to consider computation as a third branch of science, besides theory and experiment. So, 1995, this is something that is common and accepted at that point, at least according to the assertions on that website. So on the right, I just grabbed the very well-known book, this book, The Fourth Paradigm, published several years ago. It's a co-edited volume from Microsoft with fantastic, I highly recommend the book, fantastic chapters and authors in there. You look in the preface of this book, one of the first things they tell you is that this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. So what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes peeling back, what does that actually mean to have a paradigm for science or a branch of the scientific method, particularly as how it interacts with all of this technological disruption we were just talking about, simulation, massive amounts of data, or even small amounts of data in areas where people haven't been data-oriented in the past. So I'd like to assert to you that the reason we have the scientific method is embedded in the fact that we're trying to make new discoveries and advance knowledge. In other words, we don't know what we're looking for. We sort of have a sense of how things might turn out. We can construct good questions, but we don't know the answers, right? This is, of course, the whole point of research. So the scientific method, one of the things it does is it helps us root out error. One of the things we fundamentally want to do in research and discovery is propose our potential findings to the community, in part to get other eyeballs on the problem, try to root out any problems or errors or discover anything that might actually make the conclusions false or different. And so we really want to do as comprehensive a vetting as possible. So this is part of the philosophy behind peer review, for example. And the scientific method would help the person presenting those potential new findings out to the community, convince the community that they've done everything they can to root error out of that discovery process. So anybody who's done research, you know that the entire process is potentially fraught with error at any point, right? We're constantly making little decisions and doing things to advance our research where we're making these types of decisions all the way through that could possibly affect our output. And the idea is we want to do this to the best that we can to support our conclusions. So this is a question that has been grappled with in the first and second branch of the scientific method. So you think about the deductive branch, and you would not present a mathematical theorem to the community without also presenting the proof for why you think that theorem is actually true. And when you do this, there is a very well-defined notion of what it means to actually construct a correct proof. Right, and then this gets checked, and then before the theorem is actually accepted in the community, or lemma, or whatever it is. In the empirical branch, we have an entire machinery around hypothesis testing, the use of appropriate statistical methods, and a very structured way that we communicate the work. So similarly, if I presented a article about a discovery for publication, and I left the methods section blank, it would get immediately rejected. Right? They want to know exactly what we've done, and then there's a way that we communicate those methods. So here's a claim that computation, data science present potential third and fourth branches of the scientific method until we develop comparable standards. So what's our version in the data research community of a proof as it would pertain in the first branch of the scientific method, just for an example? What levels of transparency do I need to submit to the community for them to be able to verify the reasoning that allowed me to get to that conclusion that I'm actually presenting? So in some sense, we need to rethink, I think, or extend our notions of transparency to include computational methods. So this is not an idea that I thought of. Many people have been thinking along these lines. The earliest instantiation of this idea that I know of is an now emeritus professor at Stanford named John Claerbout, who in early 90s, I think even as early as 1990, maybe 91, he stopped signing a student's thesis so the student could graduate unless he could actually regenerate the entire thesis, including the figures and the tables of the results in the thesis, on the computational system in their lab. And so I asked him once, why did you actually start doing that? And he didn't tell me about the first and second branch of the scientific method and data and computation and so on. What he told me was, I noticed in my lab that new students were coming in, and it was taking them about 2 years before they were producing new original findings from the work that we were doing. When I started enforcing this computational reproducibility for students to graduate, so signing the student's thesis when they could be regenerated on their system, students were generating new results in about 2 weeks after they came into the lab. So much of his motivation was really about how can we do things in an efficient way that accelerates research and discovery. So there's a summary of Claerbout's ideas. He called this really reproducible research. And the idea is that an article about computational science, so any type of computational component, as we know, that travels with data as well, in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it's advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data that generated the figures and tables in that publication itself. So think if you agree with that, thinking through what that actually means in the production of data-driven scientific findings or research findings, I think this is one of the grand challenges that presents itself to us as we go forward in an data immersive research environment. Okay, so like I said, I'm not the only one to have noticed this problem, so I just put this slide here. These are all hot linked, and the slides will be on my website, for example, potentially shared through Datapalooza as well. But I just put together some of the efforts that people have been putting out there to try to solve the computational reproducibility issues. This isn't even complete. There's more out there than I have actually even managed to fit on the slide. They roughly fall into 3 categories of solutions. So people are thinking about what's the research environment that produces the work? Can we do a better job of capturing information around the research process from the environment? Workflow systems, another way of sort of managing the work and trying to see what reproducibility aspects can actually come out of workflow management systems. And then platforms themselves is another way that people are starting to solve this problem by saying, well, here's a place for the data, the code, the other types of information inputs, for example, that would travel with computational results. So people are sort of coming at this in their own ways. One thing I will mention is most of these solutions have been put in place by faculty and other members of the research community who noticed a problem and started trying to solve it. There's very little commercial entities behind this work. There's a few in there that have partnerships with different commercial entities, but by and large, this is an organic movement from within the research community, from people who identified a problem and started trying to solve it, and they're usually doing this outside their day jobs. So this is something that I think is really impressive. Okay. So in 2016, I published a collaborative work that arose from a AAAS workshop on reproducibility from 2016. And we called the article Enhancing Reproducibility for Computational Methods. And there are a number of recommendations, 7 recommendations we made in this short article. And I'll mention them in just one moment. But one of the sort of subtexts of this discussion was really trying to foreground the computational elements that necessarily travel with data to the discussion around reproducibility, openness, and transparency. So access to the computational steps taken to process data, generate findings, is as important as access to the data themselves. So traversing from the data set through to the final results that are in that publication, this is non-trivial and non-obvious in, I would argue, basically everything all the research that we do. So also bringing that same level of transparency that we're working on with open data to the computational steps that allow us to go from the data to the findings, I think is extremely important. So this was sort of behind some of these recommendations in this article. Okay, so very, very briefly, here's what we said. So the first one is kind of the obvious one, so sharing data, software, workflows, details of the computational environment that generate published findings in open, trusted repositories. Let's just get the stuff out there. Doesn't matter if you think it's good enough or bad, whatever, let's just try to get these artifacts out there. Add links to those artifacts in any article that relies on them. And these links would contain, ideally, some type of persistent identifier for the data, code, digital artifacts that the results in the article actually depend on. Cite these objects, so even your own work. And if we don't have necessarily agreed upon citation standards for these artifacts, data, code, other aspects of our computational pipeline, but just try and do your best. Get the permanent identifier in there. Other aspects like versions, for example, dates, authors, just try to put the citation together. We, as a community, we're going to iterate on this and we're going to converge on standards, but try to do it. And cite your own contributions too. So if you have written code to generate the results that are actually in that paper, cite it. It also allows other people who then may use your code to just grab that citation and that reference from your paper and it's ready-made so they can cite you. And you sort of help your exposure. So this is part of, addressing that summary of Claire Bout's vision about the article being an advertising of the scholarship and sort of bringing the full, complete sort of instantiation of the scholarship out to accessibility just along with the findings. Data, code, methods, all of this that goes into reproducibility and transparency in science. Okay, so the fourth recommendation, documenting these digital scholarly objects. This is a very difficult recommendation, and I think we are, as a community, just now starting to be able to wrap our minds around what this might mean for these different objects, but very important recommendation. Third last, openly license these artifacts. So part of my research has been really thinking through IP and licensing for data, code, other artifacts that are associated with computational results. I don't have time to talk about it in this keynote, but I'd be happy to talk about it with anyone who's interested. But the very short story is, without open licensing or sort of permissioning others to use these objects, they're not going to be able to use them. So we need to take that step. Journals can actually come into this picture. It's not all on the researcher. So journals could do a reproducibility check as part of the publication process. So I refer to the top standards, actually originated in the Center for Open Science here, the Transparency and Openness Promotion Standards. And so journals could actually follow some of those standards to do reproducibility checks. Are those artifacts in place? Are the citations in place? Could we actually even regenerate those results from the code and the data that authors are now appending to their work? Journals, researchers, also funding agencies. So the last recommendation says, let's take this seriously as a research problem. I think for these recommendations, the answers are not always obvious. And the development of new research in this area, I think, is very important on a variety of different scales. And so maybe we can think through how funding agencies could promote some advancement in these areas through pilot studies or other programmatic initiatives of funding agencies to encourage sort of the development of the research community around these objects. Okay, so that was 2016. And the following year, as Phil mentioned, I was part of a National Academy's committee. The committee produced a report, a consensus report called Fostering Integrity in Research. There were 2 recommendations in there that started to touch on reproducibility. Now remember, we're still kind of back in 2017 here. Our 6th recommendation said, through their policies and through the development of supporting infrastructure, research sponsors and science, engineering, technology, and medical journal and book publishers should ensure that information sufficient for a person knowledgeable about the field and its techniques to reproduce reported results is made available at the time of publication or as soon as possible after publication. So we actually brought these issues to the level of a recommendation in this report. We also touched on the federal agencies issue in Recommendation 7. So federal funding agencies, other research sponsors should allocate some funds for long-term storage of these artifacts, archiving, access to the data sets and code necessary for the replication of published findings. So that's one sort of touchstone that we were able to put into the report. Like I said, it was a consensus report that allowed people to start kind of thinking about some of these issues and highlighted their importance as we're moving towards a digitally disruptive research environment. Okay, in this year, I was part of a second National Academy's report, and this report was called Reproducibility and Replication in Science. So we clearly were doing a deeper dive into these issues. So this report was actually congressionally mandated, and so we had funding from Congress that went through NSF to national academies to support this report. And we did it in a little more than a year. The Fostering Research Integrity report was about 5 years, so it was a huge amount of work. This one we did in about a year, a little over a year. And like I said, we just published it in May, so this one is available. And we did our deeper dive into reproducibility and replication, which have now become, I think, topics of discussion in many areas across the research community. So one of the first things in the discussions on this committee that became immediately apparent is that people don't agree on what reproducibility means and what replication means. And this goes back to where we started the talk with the framing of different aspects of reproducibility. And I wanted to let you know what we converged on as report authors on our definitions that we were going to use for the report. And so I threw them up here, and I'll talk about them in one moment. And my impression since this report has been published and talking to members of the community is that there seems to be some traction around these definitions. So what we did is we said reproducibility in this report largely goes to issues of computational reproducibility. So consistent results with the same input data, computational steps, methods, code, conditions of analysis. And so that's essentially how the community has been understanding these notions of computational reproducibility. And then we reserve replication to refer to essentially redoing a study. So do you have consistent results across studies that are aimed at answering the same scientific question? So these sort of two aspects of, I don't want to say reproducibility anymore, but reproducibility, replication have often been used interchangeably, or some communities have had sort of the flip of this definition, and it's been creating some confusion for many years. So we had to decide that for our committee deliberations, and there's where we sort of landed. So I think my sense is as a community we may be converging on these two definitions. Okay, there's a lot of text here. I'm not intending for you to read it. I sort of put it up there for completion. So let me just touch on a few of the recommendations that came out of the reproducibility and replication report. So the first one is very similar to our AAAS recommendations, which is sort of share the work. So for reproducibility, researchers should convey clear, specific, and complete information about any computational methods and data products that support their published results. So we had, this is 2019 now, we had a sort of more nuanced set of discussions about what that actually means. So we talked about the input data as being one aspect that should be shared, as well as intermediate results and output data, which may or may not pertain to different research pipelines, but if it does pertain. A detailed description of the study methods, ideally in code form, and information about the computational environment where we originally executed that, it's computational study that we're talking about, like operating system, hardware architecture, library dependencies, all of these aspects to what it would take to actually get that code to run. And then we can start to understand whether that environment is actually influencing our output. Very similar to the discussion that we had earlier about the lab at Harvard and the lab at Berkeley that were trying to reconcile their physical processes, right? So the implementations in the lab aren't really the science itself. They're sort of this process of sort of generating the data they were going to use. So similarly, as we are using computational methods, you don't want your results to be driven by some artifact of the computational implementation, right? Okay, our next recommendation, that funding agencies and funding organizations should consider investing in research and development of open source usable tools and infrastructure that support reproducibility. How do we actually support researchers who do want to have that level of transparency in their computational work? Okay. The second last recommendation I'm going to pull out from this report, also a blizzard of words, but I'm going to pull out what's important, so don't worry, don't bother reading it. So we made in this recommendation a series of sort of pointed suggestions towards NSF. Our entire report was actually directed towards NSF, so even though we talked broadly to the community in this one, we were really saying, well, here's maybe steps NSF could do. So can NSF develop a set of criteria for trusted open repositories? So there's always this question of, okay, so maybe I want to, as a researcher, share artifacts and so on, but where do I put them? On my website? No, we should be doing, 2019, we can do better than putting things on your website. Institutional repositories, maybe. Are they discoverable? Other types of community-oriented repositories, maybe. So what's happening in the community? So these are issues where NSF can help, I think, provide some type of sort of criteria for where there are open, trusted repositories where these artifacts could gather. Harmonization with other funding agencies, so this is a very difficult problem. I won't do a deep dive into it here, but of course NSF's not the only scientific funding agency, and so harmonization of these results, I think, can help us as a community move towards these greater transparency goals. And you certainly don't want to be in a situation where researchers are sort of in conflict between demands from different funding agencies, for example. So NSF could endorse, maybe, or even create data and code repositories for long-term archiving and preservation of these digital artifacts that come from NSF-funded research. NSF has a data management plan. It's had it in place since 2011, and in it, people who are proposing work for potentially funding by NSF will describe their data management practices. Can we extend that data management plan to also include other artifacts like software and different things we've been talking about today, like details of the workflow, inputs, and so on, all these other digital artifacts? And then much of my discussion so far has assumed that that it's possible to make data open or code open. But there are many issues that would make that more challenging from, say, a legal perspective or other perspectives, like confidential data, for example, or privacy concerns in the data if there are human subjects. In that case, of course, it's non-shareable. And can we actually start to do research into ways to enable some of the benefits of sharing code, data, and so on, when you actually can't just sort of dump the data out in a repository, or maybe you have proprietary codes, for example. How do we start kind of closing that gap instead of just saying, well, sharing is impossible in this situation? There's certainly lots of research to be done there. Okay, recommendation, the fourth recommendation, an assessment of uncertainties, like a clear targeted assessment of uncertainties in the actual result itself. So this may go to things like replicability, uncertainties or variability when you regenerate results in a new study, for example, or uncertainties arising from computational reproducibility issues or the computational system itself. So thinking through how do we really have a very rich and holistic sense of the uncertainties attendant to findings, so when they are replicated, we know whether or not a slightly different result is different enough to be sort of counter evidence, or whether it's providing evidence and so on. So what is our sort of sense of our confidence around these particular results, and can we actually flesh that out in a very rich way? Okay, last recommendation I'm going to point out from the report. Again, it's a lot of words, but the recommendation itself is actually quite straightforward in this case, which is the responsibility for these efforts is not something that lies with any one person or one entity, and this is something that, in a sense, it's another example where it takes a village to make progress on this issue. So many stakeholders having a role to play, including educational institutions, professional societies, researchers, and how they actually collaborate and leverage in teams, perhaps, the work and expertise that other researchers bring to their projects. And National Science Foundation, for example, we had a recommendation about how funding agencies can also help. Okay, so I think I'll spend a couple of minutes just trying to give you an argument on how much of a problem is computational reproducibility. This is the last aspect of my talk. Very quickly, this was a study that I published in Proceedings of the National Academy in 2018, and I was very curious about a author guideline that had been implemented for science in 2011, where the journal said, all the data necessary to understand, assess, extend the conclusions of the manuscript must be available to any reader of science. All computer codes involved in the creation or analysis of data must also be available to any reader of science. And after publication, all reasonable requests for data and materials must be fulfilled. So I wondered how well that policy was working. So with a student and a postdoc, we actually started investigating that question. So what we did is we came up with a random sample of 204 articles that had been published in Science after this policy was in place. And then we asked the researchers for the data and the code and to see what we would get. Okay, so and one of our main conclusions is right in the first line there. 26% of our authors, so we emailed the course, so just to give you a little bit of background, we emailed the corresponding authors. I mentioned there was a student on that project. We actually sent the email from the student, thinking students should also be able to access these artifacts. We didn't email from me, right? There may be some, contamination from my name and area of research, so we had the student do it. And we also took a lot of care with these emails. So we read the articles carefully, and we were very pointed and careful about what data we were asking for, what codes, for what, and we really tried to create a sort of coherent email. We didn't just say your data and code, which I think is very vague in any particular research context. So we took a lot of care over that in crafting the emails. Still, 26% of the corresponding authors, we never got an email response back. What we did is we allowed 2 weeks to elapse, we sent a reminder, and then we let 2 more weeks go by, and then we just called it a day. Basically trying to minimize how much time we took of the researchers. 2% of the emails bounced. So this is not too long after those studies were published, and already a corresponding author link was broken. 2% wrote back and said it's absolutely impossible to share. 7% would not share. So we did have to make a judgment there about what was impossible versus they do not feel like sharing it. I'm happy to go into that in more detail, but mainly it's around things like export controls or sort of other sort of legal bans on sharing data and code. 11% of these corresponding authors wrote and said, you need to contact another person. Maybe someone was involved in data generation or code creation and so on, and they pointed us in that direction. 11% also wrote back and said, why do you want our data and code? What are you after here? 3% said, I'm really busy right now, I'm traveling and so on, but I'll get back to you on this. None of them did ever get back to us. 3% said, look in the supplemental materials, it's all there. Now, I do need to mention that we carefully went through the supplemental materials. We only emailed authors where we didn't feel like we actually had adequate information from the supplemental materials, so we felt like we had screened that. But 36%, and now I think this is actually a phenomenal result, 36% actually shared the code and the data. So, okay. So we had, and like I said, in addition, we had 24 articles that gave us what we thought was everything we needed from the supplemental materials. We didn't email them. Okay, so the upshot is we had data and code now, and now the question is, okay, so we could get it from 36% of the ones we emailed. Is it useful? So we actually went and did the hard work of actually trying to rerun the code and the data and generate the results that are in those papers. We went through and thought we had about 56 where we could potentially replicate. It looked like we had all the information we might need. We chose a random sample of 22 and then went to work on those 22. And our 2 main conclusions, our artifact recovery rate, we said about 44% of the articles in Science we probably would get the code and data from if we asked. That was our estimate. The ones that would be complete, and that was including information in the supplemental materials and so on. And then for computational reproducibility, of the 22 where we went through, they had been through sort of this kind of screening, right? We already thought we could probably do this replication. Turned out we could, right? So when we did get the code and data, except for one article, we were able to actually reproduce pretty much everything in the article. So I think that's also a real win in this study. Thank you. So our rate for computational reproducibility, we estimated we could computationally reproduce about 26% of the publications in science. So those were our two main conclusions. Now I wanted to share with you some of the responses, the email responses that we got for our request to data and code. So again, it's a blizzard of words, so I'll read them out. I'm starting with the negative ones, just FYI. When you approach a PI for the source codes and raw data, you better explain who you are, whom you work for, why you need the data, and what you're going to do with it. So that was one response that we actually got. Another response, so bear in mind, just a reminder, these were publications in science that had been published under the author guidelines that I read earlier, where all requests for data and code need to be fulfilled, all reasonable requests. So another response, I have to say this is a very unusual request without any explanation. Please ask your supervisor to send me an email with a detailed, and I mean detailed, explanation. So again, we had the student emailing. I think the student said something like they were interested in replicating the result in one of the courses or something. The data files remains our property and are not deposited for free access. Please let me know the purpose you want to get the file and we'll see how we can help you. We typically do not share our internal data or code with people outside our collaboration. So some of these strike me, they just kind of didn't read the author guidelines or didn't seem to be aware of them. The code we wrote is the accumulated product of years of effort by co-author and myself. Also, the data we processed was collected painstakingly over a long period by collaborators, so we need to ask permission from them too. So I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek about some of these responses, but many of them actually are reflecting real challenges that these researchers are perceiving. I hear this one a fair amount, right? I put a lot of work into the data and code. To me, it says, how are we recognizing this type of contribution to the community? Probably insufficiently at this point. So another response, normally we do not provide this kind of information to people we do not know. It might be that you want to check the data analysis and that might be of some use to us, but only if you publish your findings while properly referring to us. Again, sort of going to these issues of recognition, why would a researcher put effort into this if they're not actually being recognized for it in some way? Thank you for your interest in our paper. For the calculations, I used my own code. Since there's no public version of this code which could be downloaded, since this code is not very user-friendly and is under constant development, I prefer not to share this code. Real issues, but again, we have the author guidelines in there. I'm sorry, but our computer code was not written with an eye towards distributing for other people to use. The codes are not documented, and we don't have time or resource to document them. If you have a particular calculation you'd like done, and it's not a major extension of what we're presently set up to do, we might be able to run the codes for you. So they're trying to close the gap, but you can see the problems here are very real about sharing. Sharing codes is not pressing a button. Right? This is a really tough thing to do. This one's my favorite. So R is a free software package available at rproject.org. I used R for the models. As you probably know, these models are quite complicated. But I don't have to tell you that given you are a statistics student. I used MATLAB for the geometry. So therefore, the codes are shared. Okay. But on the flip side, we got some also really impressive responses. Like our program with the name is available here at a URL, and there were full documentation, tutorials, and interactivity at that URL. If you go to this URL under publications, I have a link to our GitHub repository. I don't know if I have all the raw simulated data. I certainly have the process data used to make the plots. What do you need? All the simulated data could, of course, be regenerated from the code that's available. Please find an attached zip file that has the custom MATLAB analysis code. If you run our wrapper script, master run figure 1, this will generate several panels from the paper, and it did. You basically just hit return on that. In the next email, I'll enclose custom image analysis software. So I don't have time in this discussion, but the image analysis software is sort of this huge and obvious place where we need to do a lot of work in the community. A lot of it's very bespoke. This can be accessed from a URL where there's a manual and tutorial. And the last one, if please let me know if you have any troubles or if there's anything else we can help you with. So there was a spectrum of responses from the community. So my very last slide, I think we're at this point where we have converging trends. Research is clearly becoming massively more computational. It doesn't necessarily mean massive data, but pervasiveness in data and other dimensions upon which work is becoming more computational. Research computing is also becoming dramatically more transparent. These two trends, you may see them as sort of butting heads, right? You want to sort of just implement things, and yet you have this extra aspect of transparency. I think we're actually at this very important moment where these two trends will be reinforcing each other. Better transparency is what will allow people to run more ambitious computational experiments and go in the directions that they want to go for their work. Better computational experiment infrastructure reinforces the transparency. So now we have these reinforcing trends, and I think the fundamental sort of key point that's been running through my talk is people aren't going, I don't think the motivation is so much, oh, I must conform with this instantiation of the fourth branch of the scientific method. They will do this because it enables efficiency, productivity, and accelerates the discovery in their work, and I think this is exactly where we are. So on that note, I will close there, and thank you so much for your attention this morning.
I think we have time for one or two questions.
Great.
Ron?
Quickly, how do we reconcile the collision between this idea of transparency and this notion of foreign influence is becoming pervasive in our
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, and let me know if I get it right, that we have this sort of march towards transparency, and yet this could come in conflict with recent initiatives around security, right? So sort of foreign influence and so on. So this is very real, and I think there's a new effort now at OSTP that actually focuses on these security issues, and it's something that we're going to have to navigate. For historically, of course, as you know, science and research is an international endeavor. There's no way we're not going to be collaborating internationally, and we also, I'm trying to make the case that science benefits from more eyeballs on this. So if there are steps that we need to take from a regulatory perspective around sort of respecting sort of these sort of different divisions between different countries and so on. I mean, we have no choice but to actually do that. But I think our responsibility in the scientific community is to say, hey, look, we need to do this with an eye that's mindful towards how science progresses. And we can make those arguments too.
One more. Don?
Okay.
I think you may have been alluding to this when you talked about the computational infrastructure.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of software that we build, frankly, that is within a larger environment that is totally dependent on the dependencies of that environment, some of which are very difficult themselves to bring in. So how do you get around those sorts of issues? Because it's one thing to show them, okay, I've just written this R package in the R environment, let's say, since you had that little example. It's another thing to have a much larger and less open environment, which you've been doing the work in, that you need to make up the elements.
Yeah. So I'm actually hearing two questions, so I'll repeat both, and you let me know if I got it right. So the first one is, sharing a script that you use to generate your results may not be sufficient because all software has deep dependencies within a computational system. The question is, can we access those dependencies in such a way that when I share the script, it's actually something reasonable for reproducibility? It might have a chance of running and producing the same results. So this one, I like this question because I think this is a place where tools can actually start to solve this question. And there are tools out there that will do things like sort of provenance traces when you run codes that can gather up the dependencies that get touched through that execution and bundle them up and send them on to another user. So in Python, for example, the Reproducibility tool can do this, that was developed at NYU. At least in some contexts. And I think part of the big march towards using containerization that's been happening recently actually goes to capturing those dependencies in a way. But it's true, if I don't have the dependencies and then at some point in the future I try to reach out and grab it, it may have changed. or not exist, right? And so this is, I think, at its core, a reflection about how much of the technological infrastructure, it wasn't developed for science. So we need to think, take a step back and think about, well, what do we need for science, right? Your second question, I think, was around changing incentives. Right, so for example, there are many computational projects that have been in place for decades, right? And these codes have been developed for these projects. I'm thinking about some of the simulation projects, for example. These codes have been developed over decades, and they weren't developed in an open source fashion. Yeah, it's just how it went. So how do you take sort of a robust, widely used code base that people rely on in their work frequently, and then suddenly conform it to this? It doesn't happen suddenly, right? So the question is, are there ways to start thinking about how to interact, there's a couple of answers, interact with that code base in such a way that even if it's not completely open, one of the things about these code bases, they tend to be very large, so possibly hundreds of thousands of lines of code, which I'm not going to read it, no one's going to read it. Right? So what does openness mean in that context, right? So are there ways to sort of test that code base in such a way that I understand how the software is functioning, for example, and I get some sense of the reliability of the results that I'm not going to get, say, from reading an R script like that. It's sort of a way to understand exactly what happened in this other context. You're just not going to be able to apply that methodology. So can we think about testing paradigms and what that might actually look like, or other ways to trust the software if I don't get to actually read it? And then we can think about also funding open source going forward, right? There are discussions, I think, happening in funding agencies about funding these software projects. The recommendation from the reproducibility report says, look at open source tools. How do we actually get these tools out there into accessible public environments so that they can actually be checked and understood, and perhaps more importantly, extended, right, in an open way, or leveraging more projects? So I can see you creeping in.
I was trying to be subtle.
I know.
So I would just say in closing that I think with a new school, there's almost a unique opportunity to start doing things somewhat differently relating to reproducibility and replication. We should certainly take advantage of that. What we're doing in terms of hiring and our promotion and tenure reflects that, but there's more we can do. It's also, I should say, hint, hint, a joint effort with the institution itself to provide support and infrastructure to actually facilitate what we're trying to do.
Yes.
We should have many more discussions about how we can do that here. So thank you for getting the ball rolling. It was great.